The rusted chain-link gate screeched against concrete as Margaret Chen pushed it open, her weathered hands trembling not from the October cold, but from the weight of what lay beyond. 27 acres of twisted metal, abandoned dreams, and family shame stretched before her like a graveyard of forgotten ambitions. The smell hit her first motor oil mixed with rain-soaked earth and the metallic tang of oxidizing steel. Somewhere in the maze of stacked car frames and industrial debris, a loose sheet of corrugated metal banged rhythmically in the wind, creating a hollow percussion that seemed to mock her presence. "This is what Uncle Harold left you?" The voice belonged to her eldest daughter, Victoria, whose pristine BMW idled behind them, its engine purring with expensive efficiency. "Mom, this is literally worthless. Worse than worthless, it's probably contaminated. You'll be paying cleanup costs for the rest of your life." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Margaret's fingers found the brass key Harold had pressed into her palm 3 weeks ago, when lung cancer was stealing his breath, but not yet his stubborn pride. The metal was warm from her constant worry, smooth from decades of use. She'd watched him polish this same key every Sunday morning, sitting on his porch while the coffee grew cold and his eyes grew distant, lost in memories she'd never fully understood. 27 acres, Maggie," he'd wheezed, his voice barely audible above the hum of the oxygen machine. 27 acres your father and I bought in '78. Back when nobody wanted land this far from the city. His eyes, still sharp despite the morphine haze, had fixed on hers with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. There's more here than meets the eye, always has been. Now standing at the threshold of his legacy, Margaret felt the familiar sting of her daughter's disappointment. At 62, she'd become accustomed to their barely concealed frustration with her choices. The way she'd refused to sell the family home after their father died, her insistence on working at the library. Long past retirement age, her tendency to trust too easily and forgive too quickly. To Victoria and her younger sister Amanda, Margaret represented everything they'd worked to escape: modest dreams, financial insecurity, and an inability to capitalize on opportunity. "The property taxes alone will bankrupt you," Amanda added, stepping carefully around a puddle of rainbow-slicked water. At 34, she wore her success like armor designer coat, strategic highlights, and the kind of confidence that came from never having to choose between groceries and utilities. Her real estate license glinted in the autumn sun as she pulled out her phone. "I'm calling Jenkins. He handles industrial cleanup. Maybe we can get a rough estimate on demolition costs before this gets completely out of hand." But Margaret wasn't listening to the familiar chorus of her daughter's concerns. She was watching the way morning light filtered through gaps in the stacked vehicles, creating cathedral shadows and unexpected beauty in the chaos. Somewhere deep in the maze, she could hear the distant sound of running water, not the drip of a leak, but something more substantial, more purposeful. Harold had always been meticulous about drainage, she remembered. Even as a child, visiting during summer breaks, she'd marveled at how dry his workshop stayed despite the worst storms. The workshop. The memory hit her with surprising force. She hadn't thought about Harold's workshop in decades, that clean, organized sanctuary tucked behind the visible chaos of the junkyard. While the front acres displayed the expected cemetery of automobiles and industrial cast-offs, Harold had always maintained a pristine workspace in the back, complete with precision tools and blueprints she'd never understood. As children, she and her brother had been forbidden from that area, told it was too dangerous and not for playing. "Mom, are you even listening?" Victoria's voice carried the sharp edge of a woman accustomed to being obeyed. "I said I can have Peterson draw up transfer papers. We'll handle everything: the cleanup, the sale, the tax implications. You don't need to worry about any of this." Margaret's grip tightened on the key. He specifically left it to me. Because he was dying and probably not thinking clearly, Amanda said. Not unkindly, but with the brutal efficiency of someone who dealt in facts and figures. Uncle Harold was always eccentric. Remember how he used to claim he was working on classified projects? The man collected scrap metal and told war stories. This place is a liability, not an inheritance. The wind shifted, carrying with it a scent Margaret couldn't identify, something chemical and precise, completely at odds with the rusty decay surrounding them. She found herself moving deeper into the maze, following pathways between towering stacks of flattened cars and industrial equipment. Her daughter's voices faded as she navigated turns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the chaos had been arranged to create specific routes through the debris. "Where are you going?" Victoria called, her heels clicking uncertainly on the uneven ground. "Mom, this isn't safe. The whole place could be full of asbestos or lead paint." But Margaret was following something beyond logic, combination of childhood memory and adult intuition that pulled her toward the heart of the property. The key in her hand seemed to grow warmer with each step, as if it possessed some kind of magnetic connection to its intended destination. The sound of running water grew stronger, and she realized it wasn't water at all, but the gentle hum of electrical equipment operating somewhere beneath the visible surface. 20 minutes into their exploration, Amanda's phone lost signal entirely. "Great," she muttered, holding the device high above her head in search of bars. "This place is like a dead zone." "Mom, we really need to head back. I have a showing at 2, and Victoria has that conference call with the Singapore office." They'd reached what seemed to be the geographical center of the property, where the stacks of debris formed a rough circle around a clearing dominated by what appeared to be a maintenance shed. But as Margaret approached, details emerged that didn't match her expectations. The building was larger than it had seemed from a distance, constructed of materials that had weathered decades without showing the rust and decay that marked everything else in the junkyard. The door was steel, painted in a green so deep it was almost black, with hinges that gleamed despite their apparent age. And there, at eye level, was a brass keyhole that perfectly matched the key in Margaret's palm. "This is it," she whispered, more to herself than her daughters. "This is what?" Victoria demanded, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. The building before them radiated a sense of purpose that was impossible to ignore, as if it had been waiting patiently through decades of neglect for this moment of recognition. Margaret inserted the key with a precision that surprised her. Lock turned with the smooth efficiency of a mechanism that had been regularly maintained, despite appearances to the contrary. The door swung open on hinges that made no sound, revealing darkness that seemed to pulse with hidden energy. The smell that emerged was nothing like the rust and decay of the surrounding junkyard. Instead, it carried hints of machine oil, leather, and something sharper, the distinctive scent of avgas and military-grade lubricants. From somewhere in the darkness came the barely audible hum of climate control systems and the soft beeping of electronic monitoring equipment. Margaret stepped across the threshold, her daughters close behind, and found herself in an antechamber that defied every assumption she'd made about her uncle's modest inheritance. The walls were lined with military-issue storage lockers, each bearing identification numbers and official seals. Banks of switches controlled lighting systems that revealed a space far larger than the exterior dimensions should have allowed. And on the far wall, illuminated by the soft glow of active monitoring equipment, hung a collection of framed photographs and certificates that took Margaret's breath away. Harold Chen, Staff Sergeant, United States Air Force, 1975 to 1995. Harold Chen receiving commendation for exceptional service in aircraft recovery and restoration. Harold Chen shaking hands with men in uniform, standing beside aircraft she didn't recognize, holding awards for achievements in classified restoration projects. "Oh my God," Amanda breathed, her phone forgotten in her hand. "Mom, who was Uncle?" Harold? Victoria had found a light switch that illuminated the true scope of what lay before them. Beyond the antechamber, a tunnel stretched into the distance, its walls lined with more storage units and official documentation. The gentle hum they'd been hearing grew stronger, accompanied by the soft whoosh of an advanced ventilation system. "There's more," Margaret said, though the words came out as barely a whisper. "There's so much more." The brass key, she realized, was not the key to a simple building. It was the key to a carefully constructed secret that had been hiding in plain sight for decades, protected by the perfect camouflage of family ridicule and community indifference. As she stood at the threshold between the world she'd known and the reality Harold had kept hidden, Margaret felt the weight of possibility settling around her shoulders like an unexpected inheritance. Behind her, her daughters stood in stunned silence, their phones and schedules and certainties suddenly rendered insignificant by the magnitude of what they were beginning to understand. And ahead, the tunnel beckoned with promises of discoveries that would redefine everything they thought they knew about family, legacy, and the true value of things that appear worthless to those who lack the vision to see beneath the surface. Margaret had always been the keeper of small rituals. Every morning at 5:47 a.m., she would brew exactly 3 cups of coffee, one for herself, one for the memory of her late husband Robert, and one for the kitchen window herb garden that somehow thrived. Despite her daughter's insistence that talking to plants was another sign of her increasing eccentricity, the routine had started the morning after Robert's funeral, when the silence in their modest split-level home had become so overwhelming that she'd found herself setting his place at the breakfast table, just to maintain some sense of normalcy. "You're anthropomorphizing your grief," Victoria had explained during one of her increasingly frequent visits, her psychology degree lending clinical weight to observations about her mother's coping mechanisms. "It's not healthy to maintain these symbolic connections to loss." But Margaret had learned that sometimes symbolic connections were all that stood between functioning and falling apart. The coffee ritual led to the morning newspaper, which led to the careful tending of Robert's tomato plants, which led to the drive to the Riverside Public Library, where she'd worked for 34 years. Each small action connected to the next, creating a chain of purpose that carried her through days that might otherwise dissolve into the formless ache of widowhood. The library had become her sanctuary, not because of the books, though she loved those too, but because of the people who needed her help finding things. Mrs. Kowalski, who came in every Tuesday for large print mysteries and updates on her grandson's military deployment. Tommy Martinez, 16 and struggling with dyslexia, who'd learned to trust Margaret's ability to find exactly the right audiobook for his interests. The Johnson twins, whose mother worked double shifts and counted on Margaret to help with homework during the after-school program. It was work that her daughters couldn't quantify or understand. Victoria, with her corner office and 6-figure salary managing international supply chains, saw Margaret's library position as charity disguised as employment. Amanda viewed it as a failure to capitalize on opportunities. Hadn't Mom always been good with people? Why hadn't she parlayed that into something more profitable, like real estate or event planning? What they didn't understand was that Margaret had tried their version of success once. In the early years of her marriage, she worked for Henderson Development, showing properties and managing client relationships with the kind of aggressive enthusiasm that had impressed her supervisors and exhausted her soul. She'd been good at it, too good perhaps. She could read people's wants and fears with uncomfortable accuracy, could guide them toward decisions that benefited the company while making them feel empowered and wise. The breaking point had come during the recession of '91, when she'd been assigned to sell a development of starter homes to young families who couldn't really afford them. She'd watched bright-eyed couples sign papers that would trap them in cycles of debt, had seen the trust in their faces as she explained terms she knew they didn't fully understand. The commissions had been excellent. The nightmares had been worse. Robert, bless him, had never questioned her decision to leave Henderson and take the library position, even though it meant downsizing their dreams, and accepting that they'd never have the kind of financial security her brother Harold seemed to accumulate effortlessly. Robert understood that some people weren't built for profitable efficiency, that Margaret's value lay in qualities that couldn't be monetized, her ability to remember what people needed before they asked, her gift for making strangers feel heard and valued, her instinct for finding connections between seemingly unrelated things. It was this last quality that had made her such an effective research librarian. When the Riverside Historical Society needed information about the wartime aircraft manufacturing that had briefly flourished in their area, Margaret had been the one to connect disparate sources: military records, newspaper archives, personal interviews with elderly residents, to create a comprehensive picture of how their quiet suburb had once been a crucial link in the nation's defense infrastructure. She discovered that between 1943 and 1947, over 200 aircraft had been processed through temporary facilities scattered across what was now suburban sprawl. Most had been repaired and returned to service, but some had been designated for specialized programs that the available records described only in frustratingly vague terms. The project had fascinated her, partly because it revealed hidden layers of local history, but mostly because it had reminded her of her Uncle Harold's mysterious work and his tendency to deflect questions about his military service with jokes and subject changes. Now, standing in Harold's secret facility 3 days after that first shocking discovery, Margaret felt the familiar thrill of connection that had always made her research so rewarding. The tunnel beyond the antechamber had led to a series of interconnected spaces that defied belief: climate-controlled storage areas, workshops equipped with precision tools, and documentation centers that contained meticulously organized records. Spanning decades, Harold, it turned out, had been far more than a junkyard owner with delusions of importance. He'd been a specialist in aircraft recovery and restoration, working under contracts that carried security clearances she was only beginning to understand. The junkyard had been perfect cover, hiding sophisticated operations beneath the perfect camouflage of community indifference. But understanding Harold's work was only part of the challenge Margaret now faced. Victoria and Amanda had spent the past 3 days alternating between stunned silence and frantic phone calls to lawyers, accountants, and what Amanda darkly referred to as people who understand these kinds of complications. They'd found evidence of ongoing government contracts, maintenance agreements that generated steady income, and storage fees for equipment whose value was measured in millions rather than thousands. "You realize this changes everything," Victoria had said the night before, her voice carrying the kind of controlled tension that usually preceded major family decisions. "We're not talking about a junkyard anymore. We're talking about a defense contractor operation that you've inherited without any understanding of the legal implications." Margaret had been sitting in Harold's office, surrounded by filing cabinets full of correspondence with military procurement offices, trying to make sense of contracts written in language that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. The numbers were staggering, not just the values of the aircraft and equipment stored in the underground facilities, but the ongoing revenue streams from restoration work, parts manufacturing, and specialized services that Harold had provided for decades. "I keep thinking about what he said," she'd told her daughters, "about there being more here than meets the eye. He knew this would be overwhelming, but he also knew I was the only one who would try to understand it instead of just liquidating everything for immediate profit." Amanda had looked up from her laptop, where she'd been researching the tax implications of inheriting classified defense contracts. "Mom, be realistic. You can't run a military contractor operation. You don't have the security clearances, the technical knowledge, or the business infrastructure. The responsible thing is to work with the appropriate authorities to transfer these assets to someone qualified." But that night, alone in Harold's office, Margaret had found something that changed her perspective entirely. Hidden in the back of the desk's bottom drawer was a letter addressed to her specifically, dated just 2 weeks before Harold's death. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakably his, and the words revealed a side of her uncle she'd never suspected. "Maggie," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you found the key and had the courage to use it. I always knew you would. You were the only one in the family who understood that the most important things are usually hidden in plain sight, protected by people's assumptions about what's valuable and what's worthless. I've been watching you for years, seeing how you help people find what they need, how you connect information in ways that reveal larger truths. That's exactly the skill this operation requires. Not technical expertise, I've got contractors for that. Not business savvy, the lawyers and accountants handle those details. What this place needs is someone who understands that preservation isn't just about maintaining objects. It's about honoring the stories those objects tell and ensuring they remain available for future generations who will need them. Every aircraft in these facilities represents somebody's son or daughter who came home because that plane was restored properly. Every component we've preserved is insurance against the day when our country might need these capabilities again. You don't need to understand aeronautical engineering to appreciate the importance of that mission. You just need to care about people you'll never meet and their need for protection you'll never see. I'm not leaving you a business, Maggie. I'm leaving you a responsibility, and I'm trusting you to figure out how to honor it." The letter had included detailed instructions for contacting Harold's network of contractors, security protocols for accessing different areas of the facility, and financial information that explained how the operation had remained profitable while operating under the protective cover of public indifference. More importantly, it had included Harold's assessment of what the next phase of the operation would require: someone with research skills, interpersonal intelligence, and the ability to maintain security through strategic obscurity rather than aggressive protection. Reading her uncle's words, Margaret had felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of purpose that she hadn't experienced since the early days of her marriage, when she and Robert had talked about building something meaningful together. This wasn't about windfall profits or unexpected wealth. It was about stewardship, about accepting responsibility for something larger than personal benefit. But accepting that responsibility meant confronting her daughter's conviction that she was incapable of handling anything more complex than her morning coffee ritual. It meant acknowledging that her 62 years of life had been preparation for something she'd never imagined, and that the skills her daughters dismissed as quaint, her research abilities, her gift for building trust with strangers, her instinct for seeing patterns others missed, were exactly what this inheritance required. The hardest part was the loneliness. Robert would have understood immediately, would have seen the beauty in Harold's trust and the importance of rising to meet it. But Robert was gone, and her daughters were afraid, and the magnitude of what lay hidden beneath 27 acres of carefully orchestrated chaos felt too large for one woman to carry alone. Standing in the workshop where Harold had spent decades, maintaining aircraft that few people knew existed, Margaret felt the weight of history pressing against her shoulders. Every tool had been positioned with precision, every manual marked with notes that revealed deep understanding of complex systems. This was the legacy of a man who had dedicated his life to work that couldn't be celebrated publicly, who had found satisfaction in achievements that would never be recognized beyond the small community of specialists who understood their importance. She thought about the Johnson twins, waiting for her help with their homework, about Mrs. Kowalski, counting on Tuesday visits to break the isolation of widowhood, about Tommy Martinez, trusting her to find stories that would help him see reading as adventure rather than struggle. These relationships, dismissed by her daughters as evidence of limited ambition, had taught her everything she needed to know about accepting responsibility for other people's welfare. The question wasn't whether she was qualified to, inherit Harold's work. The question was whether she had the courage to honor his trust, even if it meant disappointing daughters who measured worth in terms of profit margins and social status. Outside, the October wind rattled the corrugated metal siding that concealed one of the most sophisticated military contractor operations in the region. Inside, surrounded by evidence of her uncle's extraordinary life, Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot Harold had always kept brewing and began to read the operational manuals that would teach her how to preserve aircraft for people she would never meet, in service of a mission she was only beginning to understand. The first sign of trouble came on a Thursday morning when Margaret arrived at the library to find Detective Ray Kowalski, Mrs. Kowalski's nephew, waiting by her desk with the kind of expression that suggested this wasn't a social visit. At 45, Ray had inherited his aunt's sharp eyes and methodical nature, qualities that had served him well during 15 years of police work in a suburb where most investigations involved insurance fraud and domestic disputes. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," he said, accepting the coffee she offered with the careful politeness of someone delivering unwelcome news. "I need to ask you about some activity out at your uncle's property. We've had reports of unusual traffic, lights at odd hours, that sort of thing." Margaret's heart performed an uncomfortable flutter, but her voice remained steady. "What kind of reports?" "Mrs. Henderson, you know, lives about a quarter-mile east of your place. She's been calling in about trucks coming and going at night. Big trucks, she says, military-looking vehicles. Says it's been going on for weeks, but it's gotten more frequent since your uncle passed." The irony wasn't lost on Margaret that Mrs. Henderson, whose late husband had developed the subdivision that encroached on Harold's property, was now monitoring activities that predated her residence by decades. But she also understood that Ray was fishing, trying to determine how much she knew about operations that had been carefully concealed for longer than she'd been aware of their existence. "I'm still learning about Uncle Harold's business," she sighed, which was completely true. "The property is larger than I realized, and there's equipment that requires maintenance. I imagine contractors need access at various times." Ray nodded, but his expression remained skeptical. "Thing is, Mrs. Chen, we ran the plates on some of those vehicles. They're registered to companies that don't exist, at least not in any database we can access. That raises questions about what kind of business your uncle was really running." Over the following days, the pressure intensified in ways that felt orchestrated. Victoria received a visit from an IRS agent asking about potential unreported income from Harold's estate. Amanda's real estate license came under review for possible involvement in transactions requiring federal oversight. Margaret's library supervisor, Jim Fletcher, mentioned that the city council was reconsidering the sustainability of certain part-time positions in an economy that demanded more efficient allocation of public resources. "It's not coincidental," Victoria announced during an emergency family meeting convened in Margaret's kitchen. "Someone wants us to liquidate Uncle Harold's assets quickly, and they're applying pressure through multiple channels to make that happen." Amanda nodded grimly. Her laptop opened to spreadsheets that detailed the escalating costs of maintaining the property under current circumstances. "The insurance alone is going to bankrupt you, Mom, and that's assuming we can even get coverage once the insurance company understands what's actually stored there." But the most disturbing pressure came from sources that were harder to identify. Margaret's phone began receiving calls from polite strangers offering to assist with the complexities of specialized asset liquidation. Letters arrived from law firms she'd never heard of, expressing concern about potential liabilities associated with inheriting classified materials without proper authorization. A man in an expensive suit appeared at the library, asking casual questions about Margaret's research into local military history and whether she'd discovered anything particularly sensitive in her uncle's records. "They're trying to scare you," said Tommy Martinez's mother, Alina, during one of their regular conversations about Tommy's progress. Elena worked as a paralegal for a firm that specialized in government contracts, and she'd recognized the tactics immediately. This is how acquisitions work when the target doesn't understand their leverage. They create artificial urgency, make you feel isolated, and convince you that cooperation is your only viable option. Margaret had been careful not to reveal specifics about Harold's operation, but Elena's professional experience had made her sensitive to patterns of institutional pressure. "Has anyone offered to help you understand your options?" Elena asked. "Usually comes after they've made you feel overwhelmed and grateful for expert guidance." The answer came the following Monday, when Margaret found a message on her answering machine from someone identifying himself as Marcus Webb, representing a consortium of investors interested in facilitating the responsible transition of specialized assets to qualified operators. His voice carried the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to being trusted with important decisions, and his message suggested that he understood her situation better than she understood it herself. "Mrs. Chen, I realize you're facing some challenging circumstances regarding your inheritance. These situations can be overwhelming for civilians, but they don't have to be. Our organization specializes in helping families navigate the complexities of defense-related assets. We'd like to arrange a meeting to discuss how we can help you achieve the best possible outcome for everyone involved." Margaret played the message twice, noting the subtle implications woven through Webb's careful phrasing. He knew enough about Harold's operation to use the word assets rather than property. He understood that her situation involved defense-related complications, and his offer to help achieve the best possible outcome for everyone involved suggested that multiple parties had interests in how she handled her inheritance. That evening, she called the number Harold had given her for situations requiring discretion, a contact he'd identified only as Colonel Peterson, retired. The phone rang once before being answered by a voice that sounded like it had been shaped by decades of military command. "Mrs. Chen, I've been expecting your call. Colonel Peterson? My uncle said you might be able to help if I encountered complications. How complicated are we talking?" Margaret described the pressure campaign, the police inquiries, the IRS visit, the insurance problems, and Marcus Webb's helpful offer to facilitate asset transition. Colonel Peterson listened without interruption, occasionally making sounds that suggested he was taking notes. "Mrs. Chen, you're experiencing what we call a soft acquisition attempt. Someone has identified the value of your uncle's operation and concluded that purchasing it through artificial distress would be more profitable than negotiating from a position of equal information. The question is whether you want to resist or cooperate. I want to understand what resistance would require. It would require accepting that your uncle's work was more important than the people pressuring you to believe you. It would require trusting that his decision to leave this responsibility to you was based on accurate assessment of your capabilities. And it would require recognizing that sometimes the most valuable things appear worthless to people who measure everything in terms of immediate profit." Colonel Peterson's words echoed Harold's letter, but they also clarified something Margaret had been struggling to articulate. The pressure she was experiencing wasn't really about taxes or insurance or legal compliance. It was about power, about who had the authority to determine the value and disposition of resources that most people didn't even know existed. "What would Harold have done?" she asked. "Harold would have reminded you that this operation has survived for decades by appearing less significant than it actually is. The pressure you're experiencing is evidence that someone has recognized its true value. Your response will determine whether that recognition becomes an opportunity or a threat." The conversation left Margaret with more questions than answers, but it also clarified the stakes involved in her decision. This wasn't just about inheriting property or managing business assets. It was about accepting or rejecting responsibility for work that someone else badly wanted to control. The following morning brought escalation on multiple fronts. Victoria received a call from her company's legal department, asking about potential conflicts of interest arising from family involvement in defense contracting. Amanda discovered that her real estate listings were being flagged for additional scrutiny by regulatory agencies, and Margaret arrived at the library to find Jim Fletcher pacing nervously in the staff room, holding a letter that had arrived by certified mail. "Margaret, we need to talk," he said, his usually friendly demeanor replaced by administrative formality. "The city attorney has received inquiries about your security clearance status and whether your current position creates potential conflicts with federal regulations. I don't understand what's happening, but I'm being advised to place you on administrative leave pending resolution of these concerns." Margaret felt the carefully constructed stability of her life beginning to fracture. The library wasn't just her job, it was her connection to community, her source of daily purpose, her proof that she contributed something valuable to other people's lives. Losing it would eliminate not just income but identity, reducing her to exactly the kind of dependent burden her daughters feared she was becoming. But as she cleaned out her desk, carefully packing personal items that documented 3 decades of service, Margaret felt something unexpected stirring alongside the grief and anxiety. Anger, not the hot, impulsive anger of someone whose dignity had been assaulted, but the cold, methodical anger of someone whose life's work had been dismissed as expendable by people who didn't understand its value. Mrs. Kowalski appeared at the circulation desk as Margaret was carrying her last box to the car. "They're letting you go?" she asked, her voice sharp with the kind of indignation that comes from witnessing genuine injustice. "Temporarily," Margaret said, though she suspected the administrative leave would become permanent once the pressure campaign achieved its objectives. "This is about your inheritance, isn't it? About people wanting what you've got and being willing to destroy your life to get it?" Margaret looked into the older woman's eyes and saw recognition that went beyond sympathy. Mrs. Kowalski had survived the Depression, had raised children during wartime, had buried a husband, and managed decades of widowhood without becoming anyone's burden. She understood what it meant to have your resources coveted by people who mistook kindness for weakness. "Yes," Margaret said. "I think it is." "Then you'd better decide what matters more, keeping everyone comfortable or doing what your uncle trusted you to do." Driving home, Margaret passed the familiar landmarks of a life that was being systematically dismantled by strangers who had never spoken her name before learning about her inheritance. The coffee shop where she'd met retired teachers for monthly lunches. The community center where she'd volunteered during election seasons. The small plaza where she'd helped organize blood drives and charity fundraisers for families facing medical emergencies. All of it would continue without her, she realized. The community she'd served faithfully would adapt to her absence, would find other volunteers to fill the gaps, would eventually forget the specific contributions she'd made to their collective welfare. But Harold's work, the aircraft preservation, the maintenance of capabilities that might be needed by future generations, the network of relationships that kept vital resources available for national defense, that work would disappear forever if she allowed it to be acquired by people who measured its value only in terms of profit potential. By the time she reached Harold's property, Margaret had made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would not be bullied into surrendering responsibility that had been earned through decades of faithful service to work that someone else had determined was important. She would not allow her life to be reduced to administrative convenience for people who had never demonstrated the slightest interest in her welfare. Standing at the threshold of the hidden facility, surrounded by evidence of her uncle's extraordinary commitment to work that couldn't be celebrated publicly, Margaret felt the weight of 3 generations of family values settling around her shoulders. Harold had spent his life preserving aircraft for people he would never meet. Her father had worked double shifts to ensure his children had opportunities he'd never enjoyed. Robert had supported her decision to leave profitable work for meaningful work, Understanding that some contributions couldn't be measured in dollars. Now it was her turn to choose between comfort and responsibility, between social approval and personal integrity, between the safety of other people's expectations and the risks of honoring trust that had been placed in her by someone who'd understood her capabilities better than she'd understood them herself. The brass key turned smoothly in the lock, and Margaret stepped across the threshold into whatever came next. The revelation began with a phone call at 6:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Margaret had been placed on administrative leave from the library. The voice belonged to someone she didn't recognize, speaking with the crisp efficiency of military communication. "Mrs. Chen, this is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, Pentagon Acquisition Office. I understand you've been experiencing some difficulties regarding your inheritance from Harold Chen. I'd like to arrange a meeting to clarify certain misunderstandings that may have contributed to your current situation." Margaret, still holding her morning coffee and trying to process being contacted by the Pentagon before sunrise, managed to ask, "What kind of misunderstandings?" "The kind that arise when people assume they understand the nature and importance of work they've never been briefed on. Would this afternoon be convenient? I can meet you at your uncle's facility." 4 hours later, Margaret found herself sitting in Harold's office across from a woman whose presence immediately clarified everything that had been confusing about the past month. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez was perhaps 45, with the kind of professional bearing that comes from years of managing complex operations under intense scrutiny. She'd arrived in an unmarked government sedan, accompanied by 2 men in civilian clothes who introduced themselves simply as technical consultants. "Mrs. Chen, I need to begin with an apology," Lieutenant Colonel Martinez said, settling into the chair across from Harold's desk as if she'd been there many times before. "Your uncle's death created a communication gap that we should have addressed immediately. Instead, we allowed you to navigate this transition without adequate support, which created opportunities for interference that shouldn't have been possible." Margaret set down her coffee cup with hands that were steadier than she'd expected. "What kind of interference?" "The kind designed to convince you that your inheritance was more burden than asset, more liability than opportunity. Mrs. Chen, your uncle's operation represents one of the most successful public-private partnerships in the history of military aviation preservation. Over the past 25 years, Harold Chen Restoration Services has maintained, restored, and preserved aircraft and components worth approximately $300 million. The number hung in the air like something physical, something that required time to absorb and understand. Margaret had known the stored aircraft were valuable, but $300 million represented wealth on a scale that changed everything about her family's financial future. "The attempts to pressure you into liquidating these assets," Lieutenant Colonel Martinez continued, "have come from a consortium of private collectors and foreign interests who understood the strategic value of your uncle's inventory long before you inherited it. They've been monitoring this operation for years, waiting for an opportunity to acquire resources that aren't available through normal commercial channels." One of the technical consultants, a man in his 60s whose hands showed the stains and scars of someone who worked with precision machinery, leaned forward with obvious enthusiasm. "Ma'am, your uncle was a legend in our community. The restoration work he did on Vietnam-era aircraft saved lives that are still being saved today. Components he preserved are currently flying in aircraft protecting our troops overseas." "I don't understand," Margaret said, though she was beginning to suspect she understood more than she wanted to admit. "Uncle Harold always said he worked on old planes. I assumed he meant antique restoration, hobbyist projects." Lieutenant Colonel Martinez exchanged glances with her companions before continuing. "Mrs. Chen, your uncle specialized in what we call deep restoration, bringing aircraft back to full operational capability decades after they were manufactured. It's extraordinarily specialized work that requires not just technical expertise, but security clearance and absolute discretion. There are perhaps 12 people in the country qualified to do what Harold did, and none of them had his combination of skills, resources, and operational security. The second consultant, younger, but with the same kind of hands-on expertise written in his posture, pulled out a tablet and began showing Margaret photographs. "These are some of the aircraft your uncle worked on," he explained. "That's a 1967 F-4 Phantom that saw action in Vietnam, was damaged beyond normal repair capabilities, and was restored by Harold to full flight status in 2019. It's currently operational at Edwards Air Force Base, being used to test new avionics systems." Margaret stared at the photograph of a sleek, powerful aircraft that looked nothing like the rusted hulks scattered around the visible portions of Harold's property. The craftsmanship required to transform wreckage into operational machinery was clearly extraordinary, requiring skills and resources she was only beginning to appreciate. "The consortium that's been pressuring you," Lieutenant Colonel Martinez continued, "includes representatives from 3 different countries that would very much like to acquire examples of certain aircraft technologies. They're also interested in Harold's technical documentation, his restoration methodologies, and his inventory of rare components. What they're offering you in cash represents perhaps 10% of the actual strategic value of what you've inherited." The revelation left Margaret feeling dizzy, not just from the magnitude of the numbers involved, but from the realization that Harold's trust in her had been based on assessments she was only beginning to understand. He hadn't left her a junkyard with valuable contents. He'd left her responsibility for preserving military capabilities that could affect national security for decades to come. "But I don't have security clearance," she said. "I don't understand aircraft restoration. I'm a librarian who's just lost her job because people think I'm involved in something I don't even comprehend." "Mrs. Chen," Lieutenant Colonel Martinez said gently, "your uncle didn't need you to understand aircraft restoration. He needed you to understand the importance of preserving resources for future generations and to resist pressure from people who wanted to exploit those resources for immediate profit. Based on everything that's happened over the past month, I'd say his assessment of your character was completely accurate." The conversation continued for 3 hours, during which Margaret learned that Harold's operation had been structured as a legally protected partnership between his private restoration business and multiple government agencies. The contracts generating steady income weren't just maintenance agreements, they were preservation contracts, designed to ensure that critical aircraft and components remained available for future military needs. "Think of it as a strategic reserve," the older consultant explained. "Just like we maintain reserves of oil, grain, and medical supplies, we maintain reserves of aircraft capabilities. When current production lines can't meet urgent needs, or when we need aircraft with specific characteristics that aren't manufactured anymore, we depend on operations like your uncle's to provide solutions." But the most shocking revelation came when Lieutenant Colonel Martinez showed Margaret documentation proving that the pressure campaign against her had been coordinated by Marcus Webb's consortium in cooperation with foreign intelligence services. Phone records, financial transactions, and surveillance data revealed a sophisticated operation designed to force the liquidation of Harold's assets through manufactured crisis. The IRS inquiry into your family was initiated by false information suggesting unreported income, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez explained. The insurance problems were created by deliberate misrepresentation of the risks associated with your property. The questions about your security clearance were raised by people who knew you didn't have clearance, specifically to create employment problems that would increase financial pressure. Margaret felt anger rising in her chest, not just at the manipulation she'd experienced, but at the realization that her daughters had been targeted as well. Victoria's work problems, Amanda's real estate issues, those were deliberate. designed to convince your family that cooperation with the consortium was the only way to resolve escalating complications. It's a standard acquisition strategy when dealing with inherited assets that the inheritors don't fully understand. The younger consultant showed Margaret additional photographs, these of aircraft stored in the underground facilities she'd only begun to explore. Each plane represented not just monetary value, but historical significance, aircraft that had served in conflicts spanning multiple decades, restored to condition that preserved their operational capabilities while honoring their service records. Your uncle documented everything, he explained. Every aircraft has complete provenance, service history, and restoration records. This isn't just a collection. It's a living museum of American military aviation, maintained in operational condition, for both historical preservation and strategic reserve purposes. Margaret found herself looking at photographs of aircraft she recognized from childhood visits to air shows, planes that had seemed impossibly powerful and sophisticated when viewed from the ground. Now she understood that Harold had been responsible for ensuring that such aircraft remained available for future generations, both as historical artifacts and as operational capabilities that might be needed in circumstances no one wanted to contemplate. The question now, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez said, is whether you're willing to continue your uncle's work, or whether you prefer to transfer these responsibilities to someone else. Either choice is legitimate, but you need to make it based on accurate information rather than manufactured pressure. Margaret thought about Mrs. Kowalski, still making her Tuesday visits to a library where Margaret was no longer available to help select mysteries and discuss her grandson's military service. About Tommy Martinez struggling with reading challenges. That required patient, personalized attention from someone who understood that learning difficulties weren't intelligence limitations. About the Johnson twins, whose mother counted on after-school program support that Margaret had provided for 3 years. All of those relationships had been severed by people who'd wanted to convince her that Harold's trust had been misplaced, that she was incapable of handling responsibilities more complex than circulation desk duties. But sitting in Harold's office, surrounded by evidence of work that had preserved military capabilities for 25 years, Margaret realized that the skills required for aircraft preservation weren't fundamentally different from the skills required for helping people find what they needed. Harold's letter said this work was about preserving resources for future generations, she said. About ensuring that people you'll never meet have protection you'll never see. That sounds familiar. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez smiled for the first time since arriving. Your uncle said you'd understand eventually. He also said you'd need time to realize that accepting this responsibility didn't require becoming someone different. It required recognizing that the person you'd always been was exactly who this work needed. Over the following days, Margaret's understanding of her situation underwent complete transformation. Victoria and Amanda arrived for another emergency family meeting, but this time Margaret was ready with information that reframed everything they'd assumed about her inheritance. $300 million, Victoria repeated, her voice hollow with disbelief. Mom, do you understand what this means? You're not just wealthy, you're responsible for assets that affect national security. Amanda had been unusually quiet, reading through documentation that Lieutenant Colonel Martinez had cleared for family review. The pressure campaign makes sense now, she said finally. They were trying to convince us that Mom was in over her head, that liquidation was the responsible option. But they were really trying to acquire defense contractor assets at a fraction of their actual value. Margaret nodded, feeling pieces of her life rearranging themselves into patterns that made sense for the first time in weeks. The question is what we do now. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez says I can transfer responsibility to qualified operators, or I can accept training and support to continue Harold's work myself. What do you want to do? Victoria asked, and Margaret realized it was the first time in years that either daughter had asked about her, preferences rather than advocating for predetermined solutions. "I want to honor Harold's trust," Margaret said. "I want to understand why he thought I was capable of this work, and I want to find out if he was right." The decision felt less like choosing a new direction than like recognizing a path that had been waiting for her to discover it. Harold had been right about her capabilities. Standing in the facility that had been hidden beneath 27 acres of carefully orchestrated chaos, surrounded by aircraft that represented decades of American military aviation history, Margaret felt the weight of legacy settling around her shoulders. But for the first time since inheriting Harold's secret, the weight felt manageable, not because the responsibility was small, but because she was beginning to understand that she might actually be strong enough to carry it. 6 months after Lieutenant Colonel Martinez's revelation, Margaret stood in what had once been Harold's private office, now transformed into a command center that balanced her uncle's methodical precision with her own instinct for creating welcoming spaces. The morning sunlight streamed through windows that had been cleaned for the first time in decades, illuminating walls lined with operational charts, restoration schedules, and photographs that documented the ongoing preservation of aircraft that most people would never know existed. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had required 3 months of intensive training, during which Margaret learned to read technical specifications, understand maintenance schedules, and coordinate with contractors whose expertise spanned multiple decades of military aviation technology. More importantly, it had required learning to think like someone responsible for resources that might be needed by future generations, facing challenges that couldn't yet be imagined. "Mrs. Chen, the Edwards team is requesting priority on the F-105. Restoration," said David Kim, Harold's former assistant who had agreed to continue working under Margaret's leadership. At 28, David possessed the kind of technical expertise that made complex aircraft systems comprehensible, but he'd also inherited Harold's understanding that preservation work required patience, precision, and absolute discretion. Margaret consulted the master schedule that now governed her daily routine. The F-105 Thunderchief had been Harold's final project, a Vietnam-era fighter bomber that required specialized knowledge to restore to operational condition. Edwards Air Force Base needed the aircraft for testing new systems that would improve performance for current-generation fighters, but the restoration required components that were no longer manufactured and techniques that existed only in Harold's. Documentation. "How long for complete restoration?" she asked, noting the complexity indicators that David had taught her to recognize. 8 months minimum, assuming we can locate the hydraulic components. The original manufacturer went out of business in 1987, so we're looking at fabricating replacements based on reverse engineering. Margaret made notes in the margin of the schedule, a habit she'd developed during her library years that had proven invaluable for tracking the intricate dependencies of aircraft restoration work. Every project required coordination between multiple contractors, careful sequencing of restoration phases, and constant attention to security protocols that protected both the aircraft and the techniques used to restore them. The learning curve had been steep, but not in ways she'd expected. The technical aspects of aircraft preservation were handled by specialists who'd worked with Harold for years. Margaret's role was coordination, communication, and strategic decision-making skills that translated directly from her library, experience of helping people find resources and information that met their specific needs. "What about the P-51 project for the Air Force Museum?" she asked, referring to a World War II fighter that was being restored for both historical display and operational demonstration. "Are we still on schedule for the October delivery?" David nodded, consulting his own notes. "Tommy's making excellent progress on the engine restoration, and the airframe work is ahead of schedule. The museum is very pleased with the documentation package. They said it's the most comprehensive provenance record they've ever received." Tommy Martinez had been Margaret's first and most successful recruit to Harold's operation. The teenager, who'd struggled with dyslexia at the library, had discovered an aptitude for precision mechanical work that amazed everyone, including himself. Under David's mentorship, Tommy was learning restoration techniques that would make him one of the youngest certified aircraft preservation specialists in the country. "He's planning to apply for the Air Force Academy next year," Margaret told David. "Says he wants to understand aircraft from both the operational and preservation perspectives." The success of Tommy's integration into Harold's operation had led to other partnerships that were transforming the facility from a hidden contractor operation into something more resembling a specialized education center. Alina Martinez, Tommy's mother, had begun working part-time to manage the legal and administrative aspects of the restoration contracts. Mrs. Kowalski volunteered twice a week to organize the historical documentation, bringing her library science background to bear on records that spanned 50 years of military aviation preservation. Most surprisingly, Victoria and Amanda had found roles that utilized their professional expertise while honoring Harold's mission. Victoria's supply chain management experience had proven invaluable for sourcing rare components and coordinating with manufacturers who could produce replacement parts for aircraft that predated current production capabilities. Amanda's real estate knowledge had enabled expansion of the facility's storage capacity and improvement of the security arrangements that protected both aircraft and documentation. "I still can't believe this is our life now," Amanda had said the previous week, watching Tommy explain hydraulic system restoration to a group of Air Force engineers who'd come to observe Harold's techniques. "6 months ago we were trying to convince you to sell this place as scrap metal." The transformation extended beyond Margaret's immediate family. Ray Kowalski, the detective who'd initially investigated suspicious activity at the property, had become an unofficial security consultant, helping design protocols that protected the facility without creating the kind of aggressive barriers that would attract unwanted attention. Jen Fletcher, Margaret's former library supervisor, had arranged for the facility to serve as a research site for graduate students studying military history and engineering preservation. "We're creating something Harold never imagined," Margaret told Lieutenant Colonel Martinez during one of their monthly coordination meetings. "The preservation work continues, but it's also becoming an educational resource that's training the next generation of specialists." Lieutenant Colonel Martinez had smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose faith in unconventional solutions was being validated. Harold always said that the most important aspect of preservation was ensuring continuity. "Sounds like you've found a way to preserve not just aircraft, but the knowledge and skills required to maintain them." The financial transformation had been equally dramatic. The restoration contracts generated steady income that was supplemented by educational partnerships with engineering schools and museums. More importantly, the strategic value of the operation had attracted additional government support, including grants for expanding the preservation capabilities and training programs that were developing civilian expertise in military aircraft restoration. "We're going to need larger facilities," Victoria announced during one of the family's weekly planning meetings. "The Navy wants us to take on 3 additional aircraft, and the education programs are creating demand for workshop space that the current setup can't accommodate." Margaret consulted the expansion plans that Amanda had developed, noting the careful attention to maintaining the operational security that protected both current and future projects. The proposed expansion would double the facility's storage capacity while creating dedicated spaces for training programs and historical research. "Harold would be amazed," she said, imagining her uncle's reaction to seeing his secret operation transformed into a thriving center for aircraft preservation and education. 27 acres of carefully hidden work becoming a model for how preservation operations can serve multiple constituencies. But the most significant transformation was personal. Margaret had discovered that accepting responsibility for Harold's work hadn't required abandoning her identity as someone who helped people find what they needed. Instead, it had expanded that identity to include helping future generations find protection and capabilities they might need for challenges that couldn't yet be anticipated. The morning routine now included checking on aircraft restoration progress, reviewing security protocols, and coordinating with contractors whose expertise spanned multiple decades of military aviation technology. But it also included spending time with Tommy as he learned to read technical manuals with the same enthusiasm he'd once reserved for adventure novels, helping Mrs. Kowalski organize documentation that revealed hidden histories of American military aviation, and working with Elena to ensure that the legal and administrative aspects of the operation met standards that protected both the aircraft and the people responsible for maintaining them. "I understand now why Harold trusted you with this," David said, watching Margaret review restoration schedules with the same methodical attention she'd once applied to library research projects. "He didn't need someone who understood aircraft. He needed someone who understood that preservation is about serving people you'll never meet." Standing in the facility that had been hidden beneath 27 acres of carefully orchestrated chaos, surrounded by aircraft that represented decades of American military aviation history and people who'd found purpose in continuing Harold's mission, Margaret felt the satisfaction that comes from recognizing that unexpected challenges can reveal capabilities you didn't know you possessed. The brass key that had unlocked Harold's secret now hung on a chain around her neck, a reminder that the most important inheritances aren't always the ones that appear valuable to casual observation. Sometimes the greatest gifts are responsibilities that require you to become stronger, wiser, and more capable than you ever imagined possible. Outside, the October wind rattled the corrugated metal siding that still concealed one of the most successful military contractor operations in the region. Inside, surrounded by evidence of work that preserved capabilities for future generations, Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee and began planning the next phase of an operation that had grown far beyond what Harold had envisioned, while remaining absolutely true to the mission he'd trusted her to continue. 3 years later, the call came on a Tuesday morning in September, while Margaret was reviewing restoration schedules for a Korean War-era F-86 Sabre that the Smithsonian had commissioned for their new exhibit on aviation innovation. The voice belonged to General Patricia Wong, Pentagon Acquisition Director, speaking with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to coordinating resources across multiple military branches. "Mrs. Chen, I'm calling to inform you that the Chen Aviation Preservation Institute has been selected for expansion under the National Defense Heritage Protection Act. Congress has authorized funding for a $50 million facility that will serve as the primary training center for military aircraft preservation specialists." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Margaret set down her coffee cup, still occasionally surprised by the magnitude of what Harold's trust had become. The Chen Aviation Preservation Institute, named in honor of both Harold's legacy and Margaret's leadership, now employed 47 people and served as the primary contractor for aircraft preservation projects, spanning 6 decades of American military aviation history. General Wong, that's extraordinary news. When would construction begin? Groundbreaking is scheduled for next spring. The new facility will include expanded restoration bays, specialized training laboratories, and residential facilities for the graduate program you've developed with MET and Georgia Tech. Mrs. Chen, what you've built represents exactly the kind of public-private partnership our national defense requires. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, during which Margaret learned that the Institute success had inspired similar operations at 3 other locations across the country. The combination of preservation work, educational programs, and strategic resource management had proven so effective that it was being adopted as a model for maintaining critical capabilities in multiple defense-related industries. After ending the call, Margaret walked through facilities that bore little resemblance to the hidden operation she'd inherited 4 years earlier. The original underground workshops had been expanded and modernized, but they were now complemented by purpose-built restoration bays, climate-controlled storage facilities, and classrooms where civilian and military personnel learned preservation techniques that would protect America's aviation heritage for generations to come. In the main restoration bay, Tommy Martinez, now 21 and certified as a master aircraft preservation specialist, was leading a team of graduate students through the complex process of restoring a Vietnam-era A-4 Skyhawk to full operational condition. His transformation from a teenager struggling with reading difficulties to a nationally recognized expert in aviation preservation represented the kind of unexpected success that characterized everything the Institute had achieved. Mrs. Chen, the hydraulic system restoration is ahead of schedule, Tommy reported, his confidence and expertise a far cry from the uncertain boy who'd once needed help selecting audiobooks. We should have the A4 ready for flight testing next month. Margaret nodded, noting the progress on charts that tracked dozens of simultaneous projects. The Institute now preserved aircraft for museums, military bases, and international partners who recognized the strategic value of maintaining operational vintage aircraft capabilities. More importantly, it had become a training ground where the next generation of preservation specialists learned skills that might be crucial for future national defense needs. 5 years later, the dedication ceremony for the new National Aviation Preservation Center drew dignitaries from across the government and military establishment. Margaret stood beside a bronze plaque that honored Harold's vision while acknowledging the transformation his legacy had undergone. The facility now sprawled across 200 acres, encompassing not just aircraft preservation operations, but research laboratories, educational facilities, and manufacturing capabilities that produced specialized components for vintage aircraft. Worldwide. Victoria, now serving as the Institute's Director of Operations, delivered remarks that reflected the family's evolution from skeptical heirs to passionate advocates for Harold's mission. My uncle's genius wasn't just in understanding aircraft restoration, she told the assembled crowd. It was in recognizing that preservation requires institutional commitment spanning multiple generations. What we're dedicating today isn't just a facility, it's a promise to future Americans that the capabilities they might need will be available when they need them. Amanda, who had left real estate to become the Institute's Director of Strategic Development, had coordinated partnerships with aerospace manufacturers, military contractors, and international allies that ensured the facility's continued growth and relevance. Her presentation included projections showing how the Institute's work would expand to include spacecraft preservation, advanced materials research, and manufacturing techniques that served both historical preservation and current defense needs. The model we've developed here, Amanda explained to representatives from 12 countries who were considering similar operations, demonstrates that preservation and innovation aren't competing priorities. They're complementary strategies that strengthen both historical understanding and future capabilities. Margaret, now recognized as one of the nation's leading experts on defense heritage preservation, had been invited to testify before Congress about the strategic value of maintaining vintage capabilities alongside current technologies. Her remarks emphasized themes that connected directly to her decades of library work: the importance of preserving resources for people who might need them in circumstances that couldn't be predicted, and the responsibility each generation bears for ensuring that future generations have access to capabilities their predecessors had developed. 10 years Later, the museum wing of the National Aviation Preservation Center opened to the public on the 10th anniversary of Margaret's inheritance of Harold's secret. The exhibits told the story of American military aviation through aircraft that had been restored to operational condition, allowing visitors to see, hear, and even smell the machines that had shaped military history for 7 decades. But Margaret was most proud of the Education Center, where children from across the region learned about science, technology, engineering, and mathematics through hands-on interaction with aircraft that their grandparents might have flown in combat. Tommy Martinez, now the Institute's chief education officer, had developed programs that used aircraft restoration as a gateway to careers in aerospace engineering, advanced manufacturing, and national defense. "Mrs. Chen, we have a problem," Tommy announced with the kind of grin that suggested the problem was actually an opportunity. "We have more applications for our summer programs than we can accommodate. Kids want to learn about aircraft restoration because they've heard it leads to scholarships, internships, and careers they never knew existed." Margaret smiled, remembering her own surprise at discovering capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. The Institute's educational programs now served over 3,000 students annually, many of whom discovered aptitudes and interests that shaped their entire career trajectories. Elena Martinez, now the Institute's Director of Student Services, tracked graduate success stories that included aerospace engineers, military pilots, and preservation specialists working at facilities inspired by Harold's original operation. "Maybe it's time to expand the residential programs," Margaret suggested, referring to summer intensives that allowed high school students to spend weeks learning restoration techniques while earning college credit. Victoria mentioned that Boeing and Lockheed are interested in sponsoring additional scholarships. The conversation was interrupted by a call from the Smithsonian, requesting priority restoration of a World War II B-25 Mitchell bomber that would anchor their new exhibit on strategic bombing campaigns. Such requests had become routine, as the Institute's reputation for combining historical accuracy with operational excellence had made it the preferred contractor for projects requiring both preservation expertise and educational impact. 15 years later, Margaret's 77th birthday was celebrated at the Institute with a ceremony that honored not just her leadership, but the transformation of Harold's vision into something neither sibling could have imagined. The facility now employed over 200 people and had inspired similar operations in 14 countries. The preservation techniques developed at the Institute were being adapted for maintaining spacecraft, protecting historical manufacturing equipment, and preserving cultural artifacts that required specialized conservation methods. Mrs. Kowalski, now 89 and still volunteering twice a week to organize historical documentation, presented Margaret with a leather-bound album containing photographs and letters from people whose lives had been touched by the Institute's work. Military personnel who had flown restored aircraft in combat operations, students who had discovered career paths through educational programs, families who had learned about their ancestors' military service through historical research conducted. At the facility, "Your uncle saw something in you that you didn't see in yourself," Mrs. Kowalski said, her voice still sharp despite the decades. "But you saw something in his work that he didn't see either. You saw how preservation could become education, how individual effort could become institutional legacy, how hidden work could become public inspiration." Victoria and Amanda, now serving as co-directors of an operation that had grown far beyond what any family business should become, presented their mother with documentation of the Institute's latest achievement, designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognizing its unique contribution to both military aviation preservation and international cooperation in protecting technological heritage. "Harold trusted you with preserving aircraft," Victoria said. "You've preserved an entire field of knowledge and created institutional capabilities that will serve national defense for generations we'll never meet." Tommy Martinez, now approaching 40 and recognized internationally as an expert in vintage aircraft preservation, brought his own children to the celebration. His daughter, 16 and already accepted into the Institute's advanced training program, represented the third generation to find purpose in work that had begun as Harold's secret obsession. Mrs. Chen, my daughter wants to study aerospace engineering so she can design aircraft that will be preserved by the next generation of specialists, Tommy announced. She says the Institute taught her that the most important work is building things that will matter to people you'll never meet. As the celebration continued into the evening, Margaret found herself standing in the original, underground workshop where she'd first understood the magnitude of Harold's trust. The space had been preserved as a memorial, maintaining the exact arrangement Harold had left behind while adding interpretive displays that explained the evolution from hidden contractor operation to International Center of Excellence. The brass key still hung around her neck, though it now opened doors throughout a facility that sprawled across 500 acres and served as a model for preservation operations worldwide. But Margaret remembered the morning when that key had first turned in a lock that revealed secrets hidden beneath 27 acres of carefully orchestrated chaos, and the moment when she'd realized that accepting unexpected responsibility could reveal capabilities she'd never known she possessed. 20 years later, the final scene unfolded on a crisp October morning, 20 years after Margaret had first pushed open the rusted chain-link gate that concealed Harold's legacy. She stood in the memorial garden that honored the thousands of aircraft preserved through the Institute's work, surrounded by representatives from 43 countries who had gathered to celebrate the dedication of the International Center for Defense Heritage Preservation. The center represented the culmination of 2 decades of growth, innovation, and international cooperation that had transformed Harold's hidden operation into a global resource for preserving military capabilities that might be needed by future generations facing challenges that couldn't yet be imagined. The preservation techniques developed at the Institute were being used to maintain everything from World War II fighters to space shuttle components, ensuring that technological capabilities developed over a century of innovation remained available for study, inspiration, and potential operational use. Margaret, now recognized as the founding director of a movement that had revolutionized how societies preserve technological heritage, delivered remarks that connected the morning's celebration to the Tuesday morning when she'd inherited responsibility she'd never sought, but had learned to carry with pride. My Uncle Harold understood that preservation isn't about maintaining objects, she told the assembled crowd. It's about honoring the ingenuity, sacrifice, and dedication of people who created capabilities that transcend their own lifetimes. Every aircraft we've preserved represents someone's child who came home because that machine performed as intended. Every technique we've documented ensures that future defenders will have access to solutions developed by previous generations. Victoria and Amanda, now leading expansion operations on 3 continents, had created an institutional framework that ensured the Institute's mission would continue regardless of leadership changes or political developments. The preservation work that had begun as Harold's personal obsession had become a permanent feature of American defense infrastructure, with protected funding, international support, and educational partnerships that guaranteed continuity across generations. Tommy Martinez, serving as the Institute's Director of International Operations, announced that the program had achieved its goal of training preservation specialists from every NATO member country, creating a global network of expertise that could respond to heritage preservation challenges anywhere in the world. The Institute has preserved over 3,000 aircraft representing 7 decades of military aviation history, Tommy reported. More importantly, we've trained over 15,000 specialists who are now preserving technological heritage in their own countries, ensuring that the knowledge and capabilities developed over a century of innovation will remain available for future generations. As the ceremony concluded and guests dispersed to tour facilities that had grown beyond anything Harold could have envisioned, Margaret found herself walking the paths between restored aircraft that told the story of American military aviation. From World War II through the early decades of the space age, each machine represented not just technological achievement, but human dedication. Designers who had envisioned capabilities beyond current needs, mechanics who had maintained systems under impossible conditions, pilots who had trusted their lives to machines that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. But Margaret was most proud of the educational programs that had introduced hundreds of thousands of young people to careers they'd never imagined. The Institute's summer programs, scholarship opportunities, and international exchange programs had created pathways from curiosity to expertise that served both individual development and national defense needs. Standing in the Memorial Garden, as sunset painted the sky in colors that matched the flames from test flights Harold had watched decades earlier, Margaret reflected on the journey from modest library employee to internationally recognized leader in defense heritage preservation. The transformation hadn't required becoming someone different. It had required recognizing that the skills she'd developed helping people find what they needed were exactly what Harold's mission required. The brass key, now displayed in the Institute's museum alongside documentation of Harold's original operation, had unlocked more than hidden facilities. It had unlocked possibilities that neither sibling could have imagined, demonstrating that the most valuable inheritances are often responsibilities that reveal capabilities you didn't know you possessed. In the distance, the lights of the restoration bays illuminated aircraft in various stages of preservation, their restoration continuing the work Harold had begun in secret decades earlier. But now that work was supported by an institution that would preserve both aircraft and expertise for generations to come, ensuring that the ingenuity and sacrifice of previous generations would remain available to defenders who faced challenges that couldn't yet be anticipated. Margaret smiled, imagining Harold's reaction to seeing his careful secret transformed into an international center of excellence that honored both his vision and values while extending them far beyond what he'd dared to hope. The junkyard that her daughters had dismissed as worthless had become the foundation for work that served not just American defense needs, but international cooperation in preserving technological heritage that belonged to all humanity. As she walked toward the administration building where tomorrow's challenges waited to be addressed, Margaret felt the satisfaction that comes from recognizing that accepting unexpected responsibility had revealed not just personal capabilities but institutional possibilities that would serve future generations facing challenges that required both preserved wisdom and innovative solutions. The Chen Aviation Preservation Institute stood as proof that sometimes the most important legacies are built by people who accept responsibility they never sought, honor trust they never expected, and discover that rising to meet extraordinary challenges can reveal capabilities that serve purposes larger than personal ambition. Outside, the October wind still rattled metal siding, but now it was the purposeful sound of ventilation systems protecting aircraft that would serve museum visitors, military operators, and educational programs for decades to come. Inside, surrounded by evidence of work that preserved capabilities for future generations, Margaret prepared for another day of honoring trust that had transformed not just her life, but the lives of thousands of people who had discovered purpose in preserving the technological heritage that protected the freedom they'd inherited from previous generations. 20-5 years after Margaret Chen first turned that brass key, the world would discover that Harold's greatest secret hadn't been the aircraft preservation facility at all. It had been what lay hidden beneath it. The discovery began with a structural survey required for the Institute's latest expansion. Dr. Sarah Kim, a geological engineer conducting routine foundation assessments, noticed anomalies in the ground penetrating radar that suggested cavities extending far deeper than the known underground facilities. Mrs. Chen, Dr. Kim said, her voice trembling with excitement as she showed Margaret the scanner readouts. "There's something down there. Something big. The readings indicate a chamber system that's at least 3 times larger than your current underground facilities." Margaret, now 82 but still sharp as the library research skills that had served her so well, studied the data with growing amazement. The cavities appeared to be natural limestone formations that had been deliberately modified and connected, creating a vast underground complex that extended beneath not just the Institute grounds, but the entire original 27 acres Harold had inherited from their father. "How deep?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she knew what they were about to discover. 60 feet down in some places. Mrs. Chen, if these readings are accurate, your uncle had access to underground storage that could house... Dr. Kim paused. Calculating... hundreds of aircraft. Maybe thousands of components. The first access point was discovered 3 days later, hidden behind what appeared to be a solid concrete wall in the deepest level of the known facility. The wall proved to be a perfectly camouflaged door, opened by a second brass key that Harold had left in his desk with a note reading simply, "For when Margaret is ready to understand the full scope of the mission." What lay beyond that door redefined everything the world thought it knew about military aircraft preservation. The chamber that greeted Margaret, Victoria, Amanda, and a select team of Pentagon officials was a cathedral of aviation history. Natural limestone caverns had been reinforced and expanded to create storage bays that stretched into darkness beyond the reach of their flashlights. Climate control systems hummed quietly, maintaining perfect preservation conditions that had protected their contents for decades. But it wasn't just the size of the space that took their breath away. It was what filled it. Row upon row of aircraft stretched into the distance, each one representing not just military aviation history, but technological evolution spanning nearly a century. World War I biplanes sat alongside experimental jets from the 1950s. Cold War interceptors shared space with prototype aircraft that had never entered production. Some of the machines were recognizable from military museums and history books. Others were completely unknown, bearing markings and configurations that suggested developmental programs that had remained classified for decades. "Dear God," whispered General Patricia Wong, who had flown many of these aircraft types during her own military career. Harold wasn't just preserving aircraft. He was preserving the entire evolutionary chain of American military aviation. Tommy Martinez, now 57 and serving as the Institute's chief technical officer, approached one of the aircraft with the reverence of someone who understood its significance. "Mrs. Chen, this is a P-59 Aerocomet, America's first operational jet fighter. There are supposed to be only 2 of these left in existence, both in museums. This one..." He examined the aircraft's condition with expert eyes. "This one could fly tomorrow." Margaret found herself walking through aisles of aircraft that told the story of American innovation, ingenuity, and determination. Each machine represented not just technological achievement, but human dreams, made real designers who had envisioned capabilities beyond current understanding. Engineers who had solved problems that seemed impossible, test pilots who had risked their lives to push the boundaries of what was achievable. But the most stunning discovery was yet to come. At the far end of the main cavern, behind a section marked with radiation warnings and additional security protocols, stood aircraft that shouldn't have existed. Experimental machines from development programs that had been officially canceled. Prototype designs that had been deemed too advanced for their era, and test vehicles that represented technological leaps decades ahead of their time. "These aircraft," explained Dr. Rebecca Foster, a Pentagon historian who specialized in classified aviation programs, represent the missing links in aviation development. Projects that were shelved not because they didn't work, but because they worked too well. Capabilities that were deemed too advanced for their time, too sensitive for public knowledge, or too experimental for operational deployment. Victoria. Her supply chain expertise, helping her understand the logistical complexity of what they were seeing, realized the true magnitude of Harold's achievement. Uncle Harold didn't just preserve individual aircraft. He preserved the entire knowledge base of American aviation development. Every evolutionary step, every experimental branch, every technological possibility that was explored and either adopted or abandoned. Amanda, her strategic development background helping her grasp the implications, was already calculating the value of what they'd discovered. We're not looking at a collection anymore. We're looking at a complete technological archive. These aircraft, taken together, represent the entire intellectual property of American military aviation development from 1917 to the present. The documentation Harold had left behind revealed the scope of his real mission. Working under security clearances that were higher than anyone had suspected, he had been tasked not just with preserving operational aircraft, but with maintaining a complete technological reserve that could serve multiple purposes: historical, preservation, strategic reserve, technological research, and insurance against the loss of critical capabilities. Harold's real job, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez explained as she reviewed newly discovered files, was to ensure that if America ever faced a technological crisis, if our current manufacturing capabilities were compromised, if we needed to rapidly scale production of older aircraft types, if we required access to abandoned technological approaches, the resources would be available. The aircraft in the deep storage weren't just museum pieces. They were a strategic hedge against uncertain futures, a technological insurance policy that protected against scenarios where current capabilities might prove insufficient for unexpected challenges. The discovery of Harold's deep storage facility created ripple effects that extended far beyond the Chen Aviation Preservation Institute. Within weeks, similar facilities were discovered at locations across the United States, each one revealing additional layers of technological preservation that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. Seemingly abandoned mine in Colorado contained spacecraft and rocket components spanning 60 years of American space exploration. A decommissioned military base in Nevada housed experimental aircraft that had tested technologies now used in current-generation fighters. An industrial complex in Michigan that appeared to manufacture automotive parts was actually preserving tank and armored vehicle technologies dating back to World War. Margaret found herself at the center of revelations that were reshaping understanding of how America had maintained technological superiority across multiple generations of military development. The preservation network that Harold had helped create wasn't just about saving old machines. It was about ensuring that technological capabilities, once developed, were never completely lost. "What we're discovering," explained Dr. James Patterson, director of the newly established National Technology Preservation Agency, is that the United States has been maintaining what amounts to a technological DNA bank. Every significant innovation, every experimental development, every abandoned approach has been preserved somewhere, by someone, as insurance against future needs we can't predict. The international implications were staggering. Foreign governments that had assumed American technological advantages came from superior current research and development were discovering that much of that advantage came from unparalleled access to historical innovations that could be rapidly adapted for contemporary challenges. The Russians have been trying to recreate technologies we developed in the 1940s, revealed General Wang during congressional testimony about the preservation network. They didn't realize we never stopped preserving and improving those technologies. What they see as historical artifacts, we've maintained as operational capabilities. Margaret, suddenly thrust into a role as a national security asset, found herself briefing government officials about preservation strategies that connected directly to her library background. The same skills that had helped patrons find obscure, Information were now being applied to maintaining access to technological capabilities that might be needed for future challenges. Preservation isn't about the past, Margaret explained to a joint session of Congress. It's about ensuring that the ingenuity and sacrifice of previous generations remains available to future generations facing challenges we can't imagine. Every aircraft Harold preserved, every component he maintained, every technique he documented represents a capability that might save lives in circumstances we haven't encountered yet. The revelations also explained aspects of American military performance that had puzzled foreign observers for decades. The ability to rapidly produce specialized equipment for unique challenges, the capacity to adapt older technologies for contemporary applications, the seemingly inexhaustible access to replacement parts for systems that were no longer in production. All of it was made possible by the preservation network that Harold had helped create and maintain. Tommy Martinez, whose career had been shaped by Harold's training, found himself leading teams that were cataloging discoveries that redefined understanding of American technological capabilities. "We're not just finding aircraft," he reported during one of the Institute's weekly briefings. "We're finding complete technological ecosystems research documentation, manufacturing specifications, testing protocols, and training materials that preserve not just what was built, but how it was built and why." The educational implications were equally transformative. Students at the Institute's expanded programs now had access to technological development spanning more than a century, allowing them to understand not just how current systems worked, but how they had evolved from earlier innovations. "When you can see the complete evolutionary chain," explained Dr. Elena Martinez, now the Institute's Director of Educational Programs, "students understand that innovation isn't about sudden breakthroughs. It's about building on previous work, adapting existing solutions to new challenges, and preserving knowledge that might be needed in unexpected ways." As Margaret approached her 90th birthday, the Chen Aviation Preservation Institute had become something that defied easy categorization. It was simultaneously a museum, a research facility, an educational institution, a manufacturing center, and a strategic resource that served national defense needs in ways that most Americans would never fully understand. The facility now sprawled across 3,000 acres and employed over 5,000 people, representing every aspect of technological preservation and development. Students from around the world came to study preservation techniques that were being applied to everything from ancient artifacts to spacecraft systems. Researchers used the Institute's archives to solve contemporary engineering challenges by adapting solutions developed decades earlier for different applications. But Margaret was most proud of the human development programs that had grown from Harold's original mission. The Institute's scholarship programs had produced thousands of engineers, technicians, and researchers who were applying preservation principles across multiple industries. The career pathways that had begun with Tommy Martinez's transformation from struggling student to technical expert were now being replicated for young people from every background imaginable. "We've discovered," Margaret told a gathering of international education leaders, "that preservation work teaches skills that are valuable far beyond the specific technologies being preserved. Students learn precision, patience, attention to detail, and respect for the work of previous generations. These qualities serve them well regardless of their ultimate career paths." Victoria and Amanda, now leading preservation operations on multiple continents, had created an institutional framework that ensured the Institute's mission would continue, regardless of technological changes or political developments. The principles Harold had established, careful preservation, strategic foresight, and respect for the ingenuity of previous generations, were being applied to challenges ranging from climate change to space exploration. The preservation network has evolved beyond anything Uncle Harold could have envisioned, Victoria explained during the Institute's 25th anniversary celebration. We're now preserving not just military technologies, but civilian innovations, environmental solutions, and scientific instruments that might be needed for challenges we haven't encountered yet. The discovery of Harold's deep storage facility had also revealed the final piece of the puzzle regarding Margaret's inheritance. The brass key that had unlocked Harold's secret hadn't just given her access to aircraft preservation, it had made her the custodian of America's technological memory, responsible for ensuring that innovations developed over more than a century remained available for future generations. Harold understood something that most people miss, Margaret reflected during an interview for the Institute's official history. Innovation doesn't happen in isolation. Every breakthrough builds on previous work, every solution adapts existing knowledge to new challenges. By preserving the complete chain of technological development, we ensure that future innovators have access to the full range of human ingenuity. The Institute's impact extended far beyond its original aviation focus. Preservation techniques developed for aircraft were being used to maintain historical buildings, protect cultural artifacts, and preserve scientific instruments that might be needed for future research. The educational programs had inspired similar institutions around the world, creating a global network of technological preservation that transcended national boundaries. As Margaret stood in the memorial garden that honored Harold's vision, surrounded by representatives from 67 countries, who had gathered to celebrate the establishment of the International Technology Preservation Treaty, she reflected on the journey from that October morning when she'd first pushed open a rusted gate to discover her uncle's secret. The treaty, negotiated over 3 years of complex diplomacy, established protocols for preserving technological heritage that served both national defense needs and international cooperation. Countries committed to sharing preservation techniques, coordinating research efforts, and maintaining access to innovations that could benefit all humanity while protecting sensitive capabilities that served specific national interests. What we're celebrating today, Margaret told the assembled dignitaries, isn't just international cooperation in technology preservation. We're celebrating recognition that human ingenuity belongs to all generations, past, present, and future. Our responsibility is to serve as faithful custodians of the knowledge and capabilities that previous generations developed for challenges they couldn't fully understand. The story might have ended there, with Margaret's successful transformation of Harold's secret into an international model for technological preservation. But one final discovery was waiting to reshape everything they thought they understood about Harold's mission and Margaret's inheritance. It came during renovation of the Institute's original administration building, when workers discovered a room that had been sealed behind what appeared to be a load-bearing wall. The room contained Harold's personal archives, journals, photographs, and correspondence that revealed the true scope of his vision and the real reason he had chosen Margaret as his heir. The journals, spanning 40 years of Harold's work, revealed that the aircraft preservation operation had been part of a much larger project. Harold hadn't just been preserving military technologies. He had been documenting and maintaining the complete technological ecosystem that supported American innovation, from basic research through production implementation. Margaret was never chosen because she could learn aircraft restoration, read one journal entry from Harold's final months. She was chosen because she understood that preservation is about serving people you'll never meet, solving problems you can't anticipate, and maintaining access to resources that might be needed in circumstances you can't imagine. Those skills, patience, dedication, and faith in the importance of work that can't be measured in immediate profit, are exactly what this mission requires. The final entry in Harold's journal, written just days before his death, revealed his ultimate vision for what Margaret's leadership could achieve. The aircraft are just the beginning. Every technology humanity develops, every solution we create, every capability we achieve, all of it should be preserved for future generations, facing challenges we can't predict. Margaret understands that preservation isn't about the past. It's about ensuring that human ingenuity remains available to human need, regardless of when that need arises or what form it takes. The room also contained Harold's detailed plans for expanding the preservation network beyond military technologies to include medical innovations, environmental solutions, manufacturing techniques, and scientific instruments. His vision encompassed nothing less than a complete archive of human technological achievement, maintained not as historical curiosities, but as living resources available for adaptation to future challenges. He saw something coming, Dr. Patterson explained as he reviewed Harold's strategic projections. Climate change, resource depletion, population pressure, space exploration challenges. Harold understood that future generations would need access to every tool previous generations had developed, plus the ability to adapt those tools for applications their creators never imagined. Margaret, reading her uncle's private thoughts about her capabilities and potential, finally understood why he had trusted her with responsibilities that had seemed so far beyond her library experience. Harold hadn't needed someone who understood aircraft. He had needed someone who understood that the most important work often appears mundane to people who don't recognize its larger significance. Every patron you helped find the right book, Harold had written. Every student you guided to resources that met their specific needs. Every researcher you assisted in connecting disparate sources of information, all of that was preparation for work that serves the same purpose on a larger scale. You've spent your career helping people find what they need when they need it. That's exactly what this mission requires, just with higher stakes and longer time horizons. The final revelation came in Harold's last letter to Margaret, sealed and dated the day before his death. Maggie, by the time you read this, you'll have discovered that the aircraft preservation was never the real mission. It was training for you, for the people you'd recruit, for the institution you'd build. The real mission is preserving human ingenuity itself, ensuring that every breakthrough, every innovation, every solution remains available for adaptation to challenges we can't predict. You've built something I never could have imagined, an international network of preservation that serves both specific national needs and universal human welfare. You've trained thousands of people who understand that their work serves generations they'll never meet. You've created institutional frameworks that will preserve not just technologies, but the knowledge and skills required to adapt those technologies for future applications. But most importantly, you've demonstrated that the most valuable inheritances aren't money or property, they're responsibilities that reveal capabilities you didn't know you possessed and missions that connect your life to purposes larger than personal benefit. The brass key I gave you didn't just unlock aircraft storage. It unlocked possibilities that will serve human welfare for centuries to come. That's the inheritance I was really leaving you, not wealth, but the opportunity to discover that your life's work could serve more important purposes than you ever dared to imagine. Margaret Chen passed away peacefully at the age of 95, surrounded by the family, colleagues, and students whose lives had been shaped by her transformation of Harold's secret into humanity's technological heritage preservation system. The institute she had built had grown far beyond aircraft preservation to become the central hub of a global network that maintained access to human innovations. Spanning 3 centuries of technological development, the funeral drew representatives from every major government, thousands of students whose careers had been launched through institute programs, and dozens of foreign dignitaries who credited the institute's preservation work with solving critical challenges in their own countries. But the most moving tribute came from Tommy Martinez, now 72, and serving as the Institute's Director Emeritus. Mrs. Chen taught us that the most important question isn't whether we're qualified for the responsibilities that find us. Tommy told the assembled mourners, the most important question is whether we have the courage to grow into those responsibilities, to honor the trust placed in us by people who saw capabilities we didn't recognize in ourselves. Victoria and Amanda, now in their 70s and preparing to transfer leadership to the next generation, had created succession plans that ensured the Institute's mission would continue, regardless of technological changes or geopolitical developments. The principles Margaret had embodied: careful stewardship, patient development, and faith in human potential, were now embedded in institutional structures that would serve preservation needs for centuries to come. The final surprise came during the reading of Margaret's will, when it was revealed that she had left the Institute's leadership not to family members, but to a council of former students representing every continent and every major technological discipline. The brass key that had unlocked Harold's secret was passed to a young woman from Kenya, whose doctoral research in renewable energy storage had been inspired by preservation techniques she'd learned during a summer program at the Institute 15 years earlier. "The inheritance continues," announced Dr. Amara Okonkwo as she accepted the key and the responsibilities it represented. Every technology preserved, every innovation maintained, every capability protected, all of it serves the mission Mrs. Chun taught us to honor, ensuring that human ingenuity remains available to human need, regardless of when that need arises or what form it takes. The Chun Aviation Preservation Institute stands today as proof that sometimes the most valuable inheritances are responsibilities that reveal capabilities you didn't know you possessed. What began as 27 acres of Junkyard has become the foundation for a global network that preserves human technological achievement for generations, facing challenges we can't yet imagine. Margaret's story reminds us that extraordinary purposes often hide behind ordinary appearances, that the most important work may be dismissed as worthless by people who lack the vision to see beneath the surface, and that accepting unexpected responsibility can reveal not just personal capabilities, but institutional possibilities that serve purposes larger than personal ambition. The brass key still unlocks doors at the Institute, but it also unlocks something more important: the understanding that every generation inherits not just the achievements of their predecessors, but the responsibility to preserve those achievements for successors, who will face challenges requiring every tool human ingenuity has developed. In the end, Margaret Chen's legacy isn't measured in aircraft preserved or technologies maintained, but in lives transformed by the discovery that ordinary people, given extraordinary trust, can achieve purposes that serve humanity across generations. That legacy continues in every student who learns that their work serves people they'll never meet, in every researcher who adapts old solutions to new challenges, and in every individual who discovers that accepting responsibility they never sought can reveal capabilities they never imagined. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel.